When exploring a new Pokemon game, what do you want to see? The new gen or the old? How much of each? Do you want a Pokemon you've never had before, or your 5th Geodude? These choices are dictated by what Pokemon are available in each game, otherwise known as the Regional Pokédex. It's common for Pokemon fans to say Sinnoh has a bad Regional Pokédex. There's barely any fire types, and despite a third of the region being covered in snow, there's hardly any ice types either. Not to mention how many Pokemon aren't available until after the main story. People have talked about Sinnoh's faults to death, and I don't have much to add other than yes mama on God. But while fans have outlined how Sinnoh's Regional Dex fails, they rarely discuss what makes a good Pokédex. I'm sure some fans might say every game outside of Sinnoh has a good one, maybe other than Sinnoh and Johto, maybe some think all the games have good Pokédexes, and other fans are just mean. Well, I'm here to say, I've got a pretty good idea of what makes a good Pokédex, and that only one region has truly perfected it: Hoenn. Just to get everyone on the same page, a Regional Pokédex doesn't refer to the new Pokemon or the Pokédex menu, it refers to every Pokemon which can be found in the game. For example, Hoenn's Regional Pokédex is the list of every Pokemon available in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, from Treecko to Rhydon, from Magikarp to Wailord. I'll just be referring to this as the Pokédex. It's kind of a misnomer since the Pokédex is its own menu and an actual object the player has, but I figured this would be less confusing than saying Hoenn has the best Pokemon of any region. Now, this may come as a shock, but catching Pokemon is an important part of every major Pokemon game. From the moment you start your journey on Route 1, throughout the biomes across the region, Pokemon players seek out the new species lying in wait for them. Yet even before the Dexit scandal of Generation 8, developers needed to limit how many Pokemon players could find, if not for the game's pacing, then for the cartridge space. While Gen 2 was the first to have its own Regional Pokédex, Gen 3 was the first time players weren't able to catch everything with just the main games. Until Fire Red, Leaf Green, and the GameCube games came out, there were nearly 200 Pokemon coded into Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, which players had no way to catch. This was a controversial move on release, but became the series standard for 15 years, finally ending in Generation 8, with Dexit removing every Pokemon which couldn't be caught in the game itself. Except Melmetal, but he's a weirdo, ignore him. Once players realized they could still use their favorites in the post-game, this model was generally accepted. It's simply not reasonable to expect the developers to find in-game locations for an ever-expanding number of Pokemon, and in any case their favorites would always be available to transfer in. Always. Alright, enough bashing Gen 8, let's stay focused. So if a Pokédex is the group of Pokemon available in each game, what makes Hoenn so special? I argue there are two factors which make a good Pokédex. The first is the most obvious: have lots of Pokemon. Gamers want diverse options in games, so it feels like they're making impactful decisions as they play. In Pokemon, this means having many Pokemon to choose for your party. This is most obvious when these choices aren't present, like in Generation 4. Diamond and Pearl are the most infamous, notoriously only having one fire type available for the Elite Four, unless you pick Chimchar. Platinum is a bit better, but there's a reason people joke about using the same team in Sinnoh games. There just isn't a lot to pick from. Sure, you can try to switch it up. I personally only use 2 of these Pokemon tops, but these jokes represent a lot of players' experiences, given how popular they were. Having a big Pokédex also lets you have diverse options. Kanto already has the smallest Pokédex, being limited to only the original 151, but it doesn't help that the developers made certain types way more common than others. Water and Normal are common in every region, but Kanto also has a weird fixation on the Poison type. In fact, if you added up all the Poison types added between Generations 2 and 7, not counting regional forms or Mega Evolutions for Kanto Pokemon, there were just as many added in Generation 1 alone. Kanto's overpopulation of certain types leaves the other types little room to breathe, and that's not even factoring in how many dual types are repeated. 9 grass poison types, 3 of the 5 ice types are half water, and every rock type barring the fossils is also part ground. Obviously, having more Pokemon will lead to more types of Pokemon being available, but it's important to note that it's not so much the sheer amount of Pokemon that's important, it's the variety in those Pokemon. A choice between 3 starter Pokemon is more meaningful than a choice between 5 normal types. This is where Hoenn stands out. Yes, its dex is a measly 202, which puts it in the bottom half of regions numerically, but unlike most of the other regions in the under 400 club, Hoenn actually has diverse options for every type. Dragon and Ghost were previously stuck with just 4 Pokemon each, and Hoenn bumps this up by 6 each, not including legendaries. Fire and Electric are not as common as they'd be in later generations, but there are plenty of options as early as the 3rd gym. The only type which feels a bit under-repped is the Ice type. In Gen 3's defense, that was kind of tradition at that point. And Hoenn is explicitly a more tropical climate, which doesn't leave a lot of room to add frozen Pokemon. Considering this, a 2-stage line, a 3-stage line, a form change, and a legendary isn't too bad. While Hoenn doesn't give players everything in the kitchen sink like the newer generations do, it makes sure the options it does have are diverse. It's far from the biggest, excluding DLC that honor goes to Gen 6. Yet Hoenn's restraint relative to the other Pokédexes actually contributes to the second factor I believe a good Pokédex needs. This factor might not be as obvious, but I think it might be even more important than having lots of Pokémon. A Pokédex needs to prioritize its new Pokémon over old ones. Does the game make catching and using its new Pokémon desirable? How soon can players access new Pokémon? And more importantly, do they have to compete with old Pokémon for a spot on players' teams? Do they allow a player to connect to the new gen instead of pushing nostalgia? Now, you may be asking yourself, why is this important? The slogan is "Gotta catch 'em all," not "Gotta catch the newest and coolest." This is completely subjective, but I'd argue the biggest draw of a Pokemon game is the new Pokemon added. With how similar the gameplay was up until Scarlet and Violet, and how poor the writing has been throughout the series, discovering each region's new batch of creatures has been the main selling point for mainline Pokemon games. There were Game Freak drops in each trailer, there would get leaked first, there would get the Happy Meal toys. Do you think Grimer is getting that kind of traction? There's only room for one Purple Freak in my Happy Meal, thank you very much. While the promise of new Pokemon sells the games, those games then have to make its new Pokemon appealing to the players. Having a Pokemon on their team makes them more likely to bond with it, and I think the Pokemon Company has a vested interest in getting people to like these new designs. Fans liking these designs is crucial to the sales of all the other merchandise outside of the games. How are they going to sell their warehouse full of Turtonator plushies if no one even remembers he exists? Sure, visual design definitely decides which Pokemon the fans latch onto. Some are just born prettier than others. But a good design isn't worth much if players aren't going to add it to their team. The most egregious example is Skarmory. While nowadays he's a staple design with many fans, a lot of them assumed he was added in Gen 3. Skarmory had actually debuted the generation prior, but he was only available in one version, and only after beating every gym leader. Most players didn't see him at all, and even those who did were unlikely to add him to their team. His strong visual design didn't count for much when players were already on their way to the Elite Four. Then when Gen 3 plopped Skarmory in the middle of the game, all of a sudden people started using him. Go figure. Okay, so new Pokemon are important to a Pokemon game. What a revelation. But what was that about new Pokemon competing with old Pokemon? What's that got to do with anything? In my experience, fans resonate more with the Pokemon they use than the ones they don't. It makes sense, you get attached to your partner Pokemon as you travel together and meet new milestones. That's the Pokemon formula. What this also means, though, is older Pokemon come with a pre-existing fondness which new Pokemon don't have. For example, maybe you'd think Geodude was stupid if it was announced today. But because you've seen him for next to 30 years of hiker battles, cave encounters, and rock smash jump scares, you've grown a bit of a soft spot for this goofy looking rock. What I'm saying is, you couldn't make Geodude today, because of woke. Say you have this bond with Geodude, and the game gives you one really early on, like how Gold and Silver has it available right outside of the starting town. You then use Geodude for 3 gyms before the game gives you access to your first new rock type, Sudowoodo. How likely are you to use Sudowoodo on your team? Well, given how Pokemon games punish teams which double down on the same types, you're going to compare it to the Geodude you've already been using. And Geodude has been carrying his weight up to this point, being really good against all 3 of the gyms before Sudowoodo appears. So you'd likely need to pick between the new Goober with the winning smile, or the old Reliable who's been with you since you first left New Barktown. Sure, some people will still pick Sudowoodo here, or try to make both work on the same team, but most players with a Geodude aren't going to consider swapping it out for a new rock type at this point. So to recap, the promise of new Pokemon sells the games, which then need to figuratively sell the new Pokemon to players in order to literally sell merchandise later. Old Pokemon get in the way of this by preventing players from getting attached to new Pokemon. If this is true, why doesn't the Pokemon Company simply release a game with no old Pokemon in it? It seems that's easier said than done, as they've done exactly that before. Obviously, the original games launched with all new Pokemon. I've already discussed the lack of variety in the Gen 1 games, but beyond that, there are those who say Kanto is full of lazy designs. Goldeen and Seaking are just koi fish, Dugtrio is just 3 Diglets, Grimer is just a pile of sludge, Voltorb is just a sentient Pokeball. Now, I disagree with that last one. It's a mimic, so it has to look identical to the items you pick up, but it's harder to defend the other allegations placed on Kanto's designs. Kanto had to fill an entire region with all new creatures, and that's before considering how many Pokemon are locked away behind special encounters like legendaries and gift Pokemon, or how some Pokemon were version exclusive to encourage trading. So Kanto had to pad the hell out of its roster just to have some variety as players traveled the region, leading to some designs feeling less than inspired.
What did you just say to me, you heartless little shit?
I said I'm bored. You're boring me.
Even then, the game still feels sparse in some areas. There's a handful of routes like Route 9 where all the available Pokemon were catchable way before the player got there. There's just nothing new to find except the path out of here. Alright, to be fair, this was back when Pokemon was getting its foot in the door. They're the highest earning media franchise of all time now. Couldn't they do a better job this time? Well, they've tried. Gen 5's Black and White also restricted players to new Pokemon until they completed the story, at which point they could start finding the old Pokemon during the post-game. And, to be blunt, this is the most widely criticized Pokédex in the series, even more than the original 151. Like Kanto, Unova is no stranger to laziness allegations. There have been those who defend Gen 5's designs. I am not one of them. Object Pokemon aren't inherently bad so long as there's some kind of fantastical twist on them, right? But gears with eyes, snow cones with eyes, trash bags with eyes, there's no twist there, it's lazy and boring. Unlike a rock with arms. Now that's character design. But there's a second layer to the laziness, because a significant number of Unova's Pokemon have been compared to designs which came before, especially from Kanto. Now to be fair, some designs are just archetypes every region takes a spin on, like the early route bird, the quick to evolve bug type, and of course the starters. But most regions don't have a humanoid fighting type duo, or a powerful normal type bull found in the mid to late game, or an eyeless bat that fills up most of the caves, or a 3-stage rock type family whose final evolution requires you to trade it with another player. Now hey, you can like these designs all you want. I personally prefer Gigalith over Golem, even if Geodude easily clears Roggenrola. But Black and White gave Pokemon a chance to start fresh, to do whatever they wanted. And they ended up doing what Kanto already did 14 years ago. Basically, the only time Unova replaces a Kanto Pokemon with something entirely new is Fungus replacing Voltorb as the item mimic Pokemon. Every other time is just copying off Kanto's homework. Now, hypothetically, they could make a new region with all new Pokemon without retreading on existing designs. But I don't think they need to. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's already a handful of splashable Pokemon designs which can fill roles in each region. We don't need every new game to feature a brand new flying cave Pokemon. We have Zubat ready to go. The oceans are full of Tentacool, and the fishing rods are hooking tons of Magikarp. We don't need to redo these basic designs. Reusing old Pokemon for roles like these lets the new Pokemon focus on more standout roles. If a Pokemon designer came up with a super awesome concept for a Tentacool-style role, then yeah, they should probably cut Tentacool and give this new design a chance to shine. But not needing to revisit each and every design niche every game makes changes feel fresh, rather than like an obligation. Basically, Pokemon games need balance. They should place their new Pokemon front and center, with old Pokemon there to increase variety and fill some of the more boring spaces in the Pokédex. This is the foundation I believe a Pokédex needs to be successful. You may disagree, but I hope you can see where I'm coming from on this. Anyway, I've gone over 7 minutes without mentioning Hoenn in this video about Hoenn. How does it promote catching and using new Pokemon? Right off the bat, Hoenn does something oddly rare for a Pokemon game. Players do not have access to any old Pokemon before the first gym. This isn't the case in Emerald. They added Marill to Route 104 and Abra to Route 116. But in Ruby and Sapphire, the world's introduction to the Hoenn region, there are no old Pokemon available before Captain Bryony sails you to Dewford Town. This is the only time, other than Gens 1 and 5, a Pokemon game does this. Every other region mixes in old Pokemon with the new. Despite this, these early routes are not lacking in variety. Between the player's home and Little Route to the blocked passage of Rustturf Tunnel, there are 14 different species of Pokemon to catch, including the Makahita, which you can trade for in Rustboro, but not including Wurmple's split evolutions in Petalburg Woods. This is more than games like Gold and Silver and Diamond and Pearl have, even with old Pokemon included. Not to mention, one of these is different depending on which version you're playing, meaning they had to make even more Pokemon to make this happen. This variety is a result of Hoenn's huge number of new Pokemon. It's third after Unova and Kanto, sitting at 135, but while its 16-point drop from Kanto's 151 may seem drastic, it's an even bigger drop to the rest of the regions. Sinnoh and Paldea are the only ones to make it over 100, and Paldea needed DLC to get as close to Hoenn as Hoenn is to Kanto. Back to Gen 3, though the player cannot catch old Pokemon, they can still see some when they battle other trainers, such as the fisherman on Route 104 with 3 Magikarp and the youngster on Route 116 with a Machop. The most prominent is our old friend Geodude. Between Roxanne and her 2 gym trainers, you fight 6 Pokemon. 5 of them are Geodude, with the final Pokemon being Roxanne's Nosepass. They doubled down on this in Emerald too. Roxanne has a second Geodude, and the gym trainers now use a combined 5 Geodude, meaning 7 of the 8 Pokemon in this gym are Geodude. This may seem odd at first. Hoenn has other rock types. Where are they in this gym? We'll put a pin in that, we'll come back to it later. So obviously, the 14 early route Pokemon and their evolution lines get some help appealing to players since they're all that's available, at least in Ruby and Sapphire. What happens when Hoenn starts letting players catch old Pokemon? Let's take a look at the next town over. When the player arrives in Dewford Town, there's not a lot to do. You may bump into this fisherman, who gives you the old rod, but that's easy to miss. It finally lets you catch Tentacool and Magikarp, but it's not easy fitting them on a team. The former only knows weak poison moves until level 25, and the latter is basically useless until it evolves at level 20. Not to mention, you've likely already got a dependable water type in Wingull, or Mudkip if you picked it as your starter, so there's little need to waste time training these slightly worse Pokemon. In any case, you've been given a letter to deliver to Stephen Stone in Granite Cave, so you head there next. There are 3 old Pokemon in Granite Cave, the first being Abra. As a Psychic type, Abra is useful for the upcoming Fighting type gym in Dewford, but players will have already had access to Ralts by now. Abra also doesn't learn any attacks other than the non-damaging Teleport before it evolves at level 16, while Ralts has been able to use Confusion since level 6. Sure, Ralts is hard to find with only a 5% spawn rate on one route, but the game pulls the player aside to show Wally catching one, encouraging players to seek it out. So while players who weren't able to find a Ralts may use Abra instead, Ruby and Sapphire made sure to put the new Psychic type on display first. The second old Pokemon in Granite Cave is Zubat. Similar to Tentacool, it just takes too long to learn any good moves. Despite having a double resistance to fighting types, the fact it doesn't learn any flying moves until level 21 means it's harder to use in the Dewford gym than Wingull or Tailo, both of which would have likely learned Wing Attack before the previous gym at level 13. The last is our old friend Geodude, and at first it seems like he might be stepping on the toes of our new friend Aron. They're both 3-stage rock types found in Granite Cave, and in fact Geodude can be found a floor earlier than Aron. Does this mean Geodude is hampering Aron's chance at getting onto a team? On the contrary, I think this actually does the opposite. Let's revisit Roxanne and her 5 fucking Geodudes. What does this tell the player about Geodude? Frankly, it tells us that he sucks. Seriously, any stray grass or water type attack takes him down instantly, even the weak Bullet Seed given to the player outside of Pillowburg Woods. With how many grass and water types are available before Roxanne and how many Geodudes you have to defeat, the game is telling you, don't use Geodude, he's trash. I mean, if youngster Josh can use him, anyone can, am I right? Now, compare Geodude to Aron. Aron is still weak to water, but not nearly as bad, and her Steel type makes her neutral to grass attacks. Look at the difference here. Here's 2 hits of Bullet Seed taking out a full health Geodude, versus 4 hits hardly scratching Aron. Sure, Aron now has a double weakness to both fighting and ground, but both of these types are much rarer at this point in the game, with only Combusken's double kick being consistently available at this level. Plus, most Pokemon still use normal attacks at this point, and Aron's high defense and rock steel typing bounces them right off, making her look even tougher. These traits also let her shrug off wing attacks from Tailo and Wingull, the strongest attack any Pokemon has access to at this point in the game. This is also true of Geodude to an extent, but seeing Aron come along and replicate everything Geodude can do, while not immediately dying to grass or water attacks, makes her seem even more appealing. This inherent comparison between the 2 Pokemon makes Aron look even better than she is. Sure, the Geo diehards out there will probably stick to their main man, but other players will be guided towards the new hotness, which is Aron.
Old and busted, new hotness.
Throughout the rest of the game, old Pokemon either show up well after their newer contemporaries, like Machop not being available until 2 gyms after Makahita, or serve to make them look better, like Oddish not learning any good grass-type attacks and having a far lower special attack stat than Roselia. The fire type is both kinds. Slugma spawns alongside Torkoal and Numel on Fiery Path, but due to Torkoal's higher stats and Nummel's ground typing, it is far weaker than either of them. Meanwhile, Vulpix appears at Mount Pyre 3 gyms after these options, making it a strong thematic option for the Mystic Graveyard, but not a strong competitor for most team slots despite Ninetale's high speed and special attack. Naturally, there are exceptions to this supposed rule, like Gyarados outclassing the other physically oriented water types, Sharpedo and Crawdaunt, or Meditite not appearing in the wild until long after Machop had been available. But it holds true for the majority of Hoenn's new Pokemon. Some of these exceptions can also be chalked up to the developers incorrectly guessing how strong each Pokemon would be. I also would have been concerned about a Pokemon which can double its attack for free, before playtesting and realizing it has all the speed and durability of a wet paper towel. I can't say for sure this is the case, but it would explain why Meditite was held back for so long in its debut games before becoming available much earlier in Gens 4 and 6. So Hoenn does a good job of giving its new Pokemon the spotlight, despite how many old Pokemon are present in the region. Did this make its Pokemon more popular? It's hard to say for sure. There are definitely a lot of popular Hoenn Pokemon, but there's also just a lot of Pokemon from the Hoenn region. And again, their visual designs definitely played a factor in their popularity, regardless of how the game presents them. But I would say in my experience, most fans were fond of a majority of Hoenn's designs. I'm not sure how popular Camerupt would have been if players could catch a Growlithe before Numel, or how many trainers would have used Manectric if Jolteon was an option. But I can't imagine the Gen 3 model made Hoenn's Pokemon less popular. Okay, so that's the model present in Ruby and Sapphire, and to a lesser extent Emerald. What does the series do moving forward? Well, in case it wasn't obvious, basically the opposite. Other than Black and White, every mainline game from Diamond and Pearl onward litters their early game with old Pokemon. Sure, Diamond and Pearl could have given players access to the new Croagunk to let them use a fighting type in the rock type gym, but no, we've got Machop already, Croagunk can wait another half a game. Hey Sun and Moon, does your new bug type look a bit non-nostalgic? Just shove it off to the side, players will love using Caterpie and Ladybug yet again. By far the worst in the series is X and Y, which pains me because they're my favorite games in the series. But even a Kalos fanboy like myself can't overlook how many old favorites are made available before the new Pokemon get a chance to shine. Not just designs like Zubat and Geodude, but designs which most fans go nuts for, like Riolu and Gible. Especially unfortunate are the new Pokemon which share a type with the starters. Not only are they competing with Kalos' starters for a team slot, they have to compete with Kanto starters too. Given how most players will pick 2 starters with different types here, new Pokemon like Skiddo, Litleo, and Clauncher are incredibly unlikely to make it onto many teams. The thing that gets me about X and Y is that your first encounter in these games is predetermined, unlike most other Pokemon games. But rather than start players off with a look at what new Pokemon are in store, this encounter is set to always be a Pidgey. Pidgey, the Pokemon we'd had for nearly 20 years when X and Y released. Its evolved form Pidgeot didn't even have its Mega Evolution yet. That wasn't added until Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Why was it so important to show off Pidgey yet again? You could argue it's to show off the new 3D models, but players will see plenty of that with all the old Pokemon set to spawn before the first gym. Hell, they'll see a new model with the mandatory trainer battle before Santaloon Forest. Why not give this trainer a Pidgey if that was so important? It's just such a baffling decision, and one which serves to undermine the new Pokemon Fletchling. Sure, the latter grows up to be a powerful fire-flying type, but players don't know that at this point in the game. At this moment, they're being asked to choose between the reliable option they're familiar with, or the new one which may or may not be good. Of course, plenty of people playing these games will gravitate to the new option. It's a new game, they want to see what it has in store for them. But giving players the option to use an old Pokemon makes players less likely to grow attached to a new one, compared to just not having an old Pokemon here. Pidgey is not a load-bearing part of these games, they'd work just as well with or without it. And unlike Geodude in Gen 3, Pidgey doesn't have time to establish itself as a worse Fletchling, it just competes with it. The same applies to many of the old Pokemon available throughout Kalos. Sure, it's nice that players are being given more options, but you really ought to focus on the Pokemon these games are here to sell. Because I love the visual design of most Kalos Pokemon, I think they're really good overall. I just hate how the games feel embarrassed to give them to you. You don't need to hide behind Zigzagoon X and Y, perfect though he may be. I promise Bunnelby is fine on its own. Even the designs which fans latch onto have some help getting there. In 2020, Pokemon held a poll to determine who the most popular Pokemon were. Looking at Kalos' top 30, most of the winners were helped by the anime, like Greninja, Sylveon, and Deden. Out of those which weren't part of Ash and his friends' teams, the standouts were Aegislash in 3rd, Tyrantrum in 10th, and Meowstic in 13th. Aegislash and Meowstic both get their starts on Route 6 as Honedge and Esper, respectively. Honedge actually didn't have any competition. Unless you're some kind of freak who managed to evolve their Riolu into a Lucario before level 20, this is the first Steel type available in X and Y, and the first Ghost type, full stop. Both of these types are incredibly rare this early in the game and have great synergy together, so it's not surprising that many fans would decide to include Hoenn on their team. Esper was less fortunate, competing with Ralts before Lumio City and Abra after, but in fairness, both of them are pretty uncommon, and unlike Ralts in Gen 3, the game doesn't pull you aside to point them out. As for Tyrantrum, it may have gotten a spot because it has a unique typing, allowing it to stand out from other rocks and dragons available at this point, or it might be because it's a goddamn Tyrannosaurus Rex. Who can truly say? I've been harping on X and Y for a while here, but everything I've said about it applies to the other regions too. It's just the freshest in my memory after Gen 3, and I hope knowing that I love these games despite their flaws softens the criticism for my fellow fans. Really, I just think it's a shame the series got this balance right exactly once and never did it again. It turns out, making a lot of Pokemon is a lot of work. Sure, if you're browsing the many talented artists making Fakemon content, it may seem like there's a lot of room to grow. But having a team create over 100 unique and appealing designs every 3 or 4 years is a tall task, especially when considering that designers have allegedly had to abandon designs in the past for being too similar to fan-made designs. The model set out by Hoenn's Pokédex is only possible thanks to the huge roster of new Pokemon added to the region. Out of the Hoenn Dex's 202 Pokemon, 135 are brand new. That's about 2 new Pokemon for every returning one. The next best ratio, outside of the 100% from Kanto and Unova, comes from the Diamond and Pearl Pokédex, with 81 out of 151 entries being new Pokemon, or roughly 54%. If you're thinking to yourself, didn't Sinnoh add more than 81 Pokemon? You'd be right. However, a considerable number of them were unavailable until after you'd beaten the game, mostly the cross-gen evolutions. If you've ever looked at the Pokemon in National Pokédex order and wondered why all but a handful of these evolutions are listed at the end, it's because Diamond and Pearl pretended they didn't exist. Other Pokemon fans have already harped on Sinnoh for its lack of options, so I won't dig into it here. But it truly is crazy how much is not available to the player until after they finish the game. Thankfully, these Pokemon were added to Platinum's updated Pokédex alongside Rotom, Giratina, and a handful of returning Pokemon. This increased the total new Pokemon to 102, but reduced the percentage to just under half of this new Pokédex. Most of the other regions just scrape past 25% or sit in the low 20s. And I hate to nag it yet again, but Kalos, my precious baby boy, he didn't even make it to 16%? Alright, let's try to be fair here. Kalos added Mega Evolutions for 25 existing Pokemon. If you take all the members of those evolutionary lines and count them as Kalos Pokemon, you get 27%, which is higher than every region which came after it. But that's still rough, especially since most of these Mega Evolutions aren't available until after you've beaten the game. My point is, it's all a numbers game. Hoenn could maintain its balance of old and new because it added so many new Pokemon. Sinnoh has the next best ratio, but because it had less new Pokemon, the balance wasn't there. Starting with X and Y, the games have been expanding their old Pokemon rep even further, while never again reaching the amount of new Pokemon Hoenn has. They did improve this a bit with the introduction of regional forms, new takes on old Pokemon which were both new to the player and less intensive to design, but even then, the old Pokemon without regional forms outnumbered 2 to 1 in Sun and Moon, and that's the best ratio we've had since. Of course, I don't know if the developers want to adhere to the Pokédex model outlined in Gen 3. Hell, I can't even say for sure they did it on purpose in Gen 3. It's not like I was there. But regardless of what they were going for, the way they implemented the Pokemon in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald was effective at elevating its new Pokemon. There's always some sentiment about how, Pokemon designs were just better back in my day, and while nostalgia definitely plays into that, I can't help but feel the latest games aren't trying to make their new Pokemon appealing. I'm sure the designers are putting a lot of work into honing and perfecting each new creature they add, but it doesn't matter how good your new soda is if everyone's going to keep drinking Coke. I don't think we'll get another mainline Pokemon game with this model, given how each new regional dex has at least 400 entries, but I'd like to see more consideration over which old Pokemon are included and at what point in the game, if only to help some of the early game Pokemon. Thank you for watching. I know this is a departure from my normal Smash moveset videos, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to know what you think. Please let me know in the comments if you agree with the criteria I've listed, or if there's something else a Pokédex needs to be considered good. Are there any shortcomings in the Hoenn Pokédex I didn't cover? Maybe you picked up something I missed. That'll about do it for this video. I'm going to try and get my next Smash moveset done as soon as possible. I'll see if I make any other videos in between then. If you like the cut of my jib or just like telling me that I'm wrong, feel free to subscribe to the channel so you always catch another video coming out.
Again! Again! Again!